The Titanic was a British passenger liner that was operated by the White Star Line Company. Being the largest and safest ship ever built, it was considered unsinkable. On the way from Southampton to New York City, it hit an iceberg and it sank in the North Atlantic Ocean on its maiden voyage, due to mistakes made by both crew and the captain. Many people froze to death on this fateful night, and out of the 3,300 passengers and crew aboard the ship, more than 1,500 people died. This sensitive topic is very important to remember because it was one of the largest non-war related disasters prior to the attacks of September 11, 2001. First, I will discuss the Titanic and how its build contributed to the disaster, then the sinking of the Titanic, and lastly, the aftermath of the sinking. First, I will discuss the architecture of the Titanic and how it contributed to the disaster. The Titanic was 882 feet long and weighed 46,000 tons. It was so huge that each first class passenger room had a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, 2 closets, a private bath, and a bathroom. The first class dining room was so big, it could serve 500 passengers at once. And first-class passengers had many luxuries, including a swimming pool, library, barbershop, and even a darkroom for photographs. The captain of the ship was named Captain Edward Smith, and he died along with his ship. He was the senior captain of the White Star Line, and he was a very famous captain at that. He was popular with both the crew and passengers and was dubbed the Millionaire's Captain. Many believed it was actually his fault that the Titanic sank because Captain Smith faced pressure from the White Star Line to keep up the ship's speed, and he ignored warnings about icebergs from other ships. When the Titanic hit at roughly 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, the massive ship's speed and the side impact, instead of a head-on collision, which might have prevented as much damage, caused enough damage to allow water to flood into 6 of the 16 watertight compartments that were made to keep the water out so the ship could stay afloat even if it hit and took damage. It could only take water in 5 of the compartments for it to stay afloat, is why it sank. The weather was actually perfect for sailing the entire trip. This journey took a horrible turn when it struck an iceberg and started to sink, which is my second point, the actual sinking of the Titanic. The collision occurred at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, April 14, 1912. Despite the multiple ice warnings from the other ships in the area, the captain ordered the crew to keep the Titanic going full speed ahead, since the captain had pressures from the White Star Company to make this maiden voyage of the Titanic in record time. When the ship hit the iceberg, the watertight compartments were punctured, and the first 6 compartments rapidly filled with water. Distress rockets were fired, but there was no ships close enough to arrive in time. There were only 20 lifeboats on the ship, which was room for about 700 passengers, and 3,300 people on board at this time. So as the ship started to sink, the passengers were forced to float in the freezing water until they hoped help would arrive. The ship broke in half because of the weight of the water in the front end of the ship at 2:20 a.m. and disappeared under the waves. It took more than 2 hours for anyone to reach them. The water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. It was almost impossible to survive the frigid waters, and almost everyone in the water died. It only took 30 minutes for them to freeze to death in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, and it took over 2 hours for anyone to save them. Which brings me to my third point, the aftermath of the sinking of the Titanic. The ship sunk at 2:20 a.m. and at 4:10 a.m., a little less than 2 hours after it started to sink, the Carpathia answered Titanic's distress call and arrived to rescue the survivors. But with 2 hours in the icy water, many people died because, like I said, it took 30 minutes for them to freeze to death. They froze to death in the frozen North Atlantic Sea, and Captain Smith was one of the people to die upon the ship. There were 3,300 passengers and crew aboard the Titanic, and more than 1,500 died. So almost half the people that were on the Titanic died. 59 of those who died were under the age of 14. They were children. The youngest to die was only 13 months. During this speech, I have provided information on the infamous sinking of the RMS Titanic. I have discussed the build of the Titanic and how it contributed to the crash, the sinking itself, and the aftermath of the tragic event. I hope that this speech brings an awareness of what happened on this fateful night, and with this speech, this infamous night in history will be remembered a little more closely than before. This speech purpose was to inform the audience of the events that took place on April 14th, 1912, and the events that took place afterwards. Thank you.